The world was dying, and it was doing so with a spectacular lack of drama. For the 1.2 million human souls trapped on the forge outpost of Calthos Tertius, the apocalypse began not with a scream, but with a whisper, a soft, pervasive hiss from the ancient voxcasters, followed by a single, flat sentence that repeated on a loop. "The Mandeville Point is compromised. The warp is here. There will be no evacuation. Omnissiah protect you." Magos Explorator Kalen heard the message not through the external speakers of his laboratory, but as a raw, painful data burst directly into the cognitive wetware of his brain. It was a Priority 1 override, a scream in binary that bypassed all auditory processing and etched itself directly onto his consciousness. For a full 3 seconds, his organic heart, the one piece of his body he had stubbornly refused to replace, hammered against his ribcage like a trapped bird. Then his subroutines kicked in, flooding his system with synthetic calmatives. The fear was quarantined, analyzed, and filed away as irrelevant data. He stood, the servo joints in his legs whirring softly. His laboratory was a cathedral to logic, a vast, circular chamber buried deep within the planet's crust. Schematics of Xenos artifacts hovered in the air, glowing green and gold. On a central plinth, the prize of his decades-long expedition rested, a shard of obsidian-like material covered in spiraling, non-Euclidean glyphs that seemed to drink the light from the room. It was a fragment of a Necron pylon, a piece of ancient anti-warp technology he had been tasked to understand. Now it felt like a cruel joke. "Lysandra," he voxed, his voice a synthesized monotone that betrayed none of the chaos his biological core was still struggling to process. A moment of static, then a voice, young, human, and frayed with panic. "Magos, the message, did you hear?" "I have processed the data stream," Kalen interrupted. "Status of the primary void shields?" "Holding that for now. But the aspects, Magos, the readings are impossible. The sky, it's bleeding." Kalen's multi-lensed optic cluster cycled through several spectra, pulling up the external feed from the surface. What he saw defied his every logical parameter. Calthos Tertius was a barren rock, its surface a windswept plain of rust-red dust under a pale white sun. Now that sun was gone, replaced by a colossal swirling vortex of impossible colors. Peacock green and bruise purple bled into a sickly, phosphorescent orange. It was not a cloud formation. It was a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Lightning the color of old blood arced from its heart, not striking the ground so much as licking it. Where it touched, the very substance of the world changed. The red dust was turning to a glistening, fleshy substance. Spires of bone, impossibly tall and twisted, were erupting from the plains, growing at a visible rate. The Geller field failure was not instantaneous, Kalen murmured, more to himself than to his apprentice. A cascade rupture. The imperial tide is not merely surrounding us, it is seeping in. "What do we do?" Lysandra's voice was a plea. "The protocol is clear. We seal the sublevels. We preserve the knowledge. We wait for a response from the fleet." "There is no fleet," the message said. "The message is a data point. Faith in the Omnissiah is a constant." Even as he said the words, they felt hollow, a recitation of dogma in the face of a phenomenon that mocked all dogma. His enhanced eyes tracked a new horror on the feed. A shape was moving through the new, fleshy landscape. It was roughly humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its movements a spasmodic, jerking dance. It was made of the same glistening meat as the ground, but studded with weeping eyes and a single, lamprey-like mouth that opened and closed soundlessly. It was not a creature that had arrived. It was a creature that had been grown. Then the Voxnet exploded. It was a cacophony of screams, prayers, and static. But beneath it, a new signal began to pulse, a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a monstrous heartbeat that seemed to resonate not through the air, but through the mind. Kalen's audio dampeners activated automatically, but the sound was not truly sound. It was a psychic frequency, and it was getting louder. The workers in Hab Block Gamma, a strained voice cut through the chaos. A security officer by the cadence. They're changing. Their skin is sloughing off. They're singing! By the throne, they're singing! Kalen switched feeds to the internal picked casters of Hab Block Gamma. Lysandra, he voxed, his voice devoid of all emotion. Forget Protocol Theta, new priority. I need you to gather a team, our best electro-priests and logic engineers, and bring the sacred oils of unmaking from the vault. The oils of unmaking? Magos, those are for last rites, for the scouring of corrupted data cores. The situation has evolved, Kalen stated, his mechanical hands closing around the cool, dark surface of the Necron shard. A jolt, like static electricity but infinitely colder, shot up his arms. We are not preventing corruption anymore, apprentice. We are performing an amputation, and we are starting with the soul. In Hab Block Gamma, the singing had reached a crescendo. Former laborer Arvin, now a pulsating mound of organically fused flesh and metal with 6 twitching limbs, felt a joy so profound it was agony. The lies of the corpse emperor were gone. The tedious, rigid structure of his life was gone. He was free. His body was a canvas, and the great artist was painting with his very essence. He reached out a pseudopod of living matter and touched the wall. The plasteel wept rust-colored tears and then bloomed into a beautiful, screaming face made of molten metal. It was perfect. He did not see the team of Skitarii Vanguard who breached the door, their rad carbines glowing with poisonous energy. He only felt a sudden jarring dissonance in the glorious symphony. Their presence was a null space, a boring gray blot on the magnificent tapestry. Their weapons fired, not bullets, but waves of radiation that caused his beautiful new flesh to blacken and slough away. It was not pain, not as he remembered it. It was criticism, an insult to the art. With a gurgling roar of righteous indignation, he and his newly born kin surged forward. They would teach these stagnant ones the beauty of change. They would pull them into the song. The war for Calthos Tertius was not a battle for territory. It was a war of definitions. A conflict between those who had embraced the glorious, terrible truth of the universe's infinite potential and those who clung to the pathetic, crumbling lie of order. And in the depths, Amagos prepared to wield a weapon that rejected both. 3 cycles had passed since the sky tore open. On the surface, time had lost all meaning, but deep in the archive spire, the chronometers still ticked with a desperate mechanical insistence. Magos Kalen's sanctuary was a tomb waiting to be inhabited. The air, once cool and cycled, was now thick with the smell of ozone. hot metal and the faint coppery tang of blood that the filters could not entirely scrub. The low psychic thrumming was a constant pressure, a weight on the soul that no amount of augmetic damping could fully eliminate. It was the sound of the world's fever dream. The centerpiece of the lab was no longer the analysis plinth. It had been transformed into a brutalist engine of heresy. The Necron shard, now glowing with a steady, sickly green light, was suspended in a complex cage of copper wire and arcane circuitry. It was connected to a bank of thrumming plasma generators, their hum a defiant counterpoint to the warp's melody. Wires snaked from the cage to the walls, where they fused with the outpost's primary power conduits. This was Kalen's gambit, to use the pylon shard as a focus, to project a localized null field, a bubble of dead space where the warp could not gain purchase. Lysandra worked at a console, her hands trembling slightly. The young adept had aged a decade in 3 cycles. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed. She had seen the picked feeds from the upper levels before they went dark. She had heard the final, gurgling transmissions. "The resonance is increasing, Magos," she reported, her voice strained. "It's adapting. It's finding frequencies that resonate with our own neural architecture. 2 more tech acolytes in Sector 7 have succumbed. They started carving the song into their own flesh with data spikes." Kalen did not look up from his work, his mechadendrites fine-tuning the alignment of the focusing array. Their weakness was a statistical probability. Log their names for purging and continue. Purging. Magos, they were conduits for a hostile mimetic agent, Kalen stated flatly. Their biological components became a liability. The lesson is clear, Lysandra. The flesh is weak. It is a radio receiver for this insanity. We must insulate ourselves further. He gestured with a metallic claw towards a rack of surgical tools. The full cortical isolation procedure would increase your resistance by 87%. Lysandra recoiled. The procedure would sever the connection between her brain's emotional centers and her higher consciousness. It would make her as cold and logical as the Magos. It would save her life, but it would destroy her. She would become a machine, incapable of feeling the very terror that threatened to consume her. Was that salvation or merely a different kind of damnation? I will consider it, Magos," she whispered. A blast of static erupted from the main Vox unit, followed by a voice they had not heard since the first hour. It was Praetor Valerius, commander of the outpost's Scutarii garrison. The signal was weak, shredded by interference, but the Praetor's dogged binaric cant was unmistakable. "Kalen. Respond. The granite citadel holds, but the enemy is not an enemy. It is the environment. The very air curdles. We are engaging manifestations. Our radiation weapons are effective but temporary. They reconstitute." Kalen opened a channel. "Praetor, your status is noted. The Sanctuary project is 70% complete. Can you hold your position for another 6 cycles? Negative. The word was final. The Citadel's lower levels have been assimilated. The walls themselves have become a membranous tissue. We are being digested, Magos. I am initiating a fighting retreat to your location. We will secure the archive spire. Prepare for our arrival. And Magos, we are not alone. There are others, survivors, Unchanged. Unchanged? Lysandra breathed, a flicker of hope in her eyes. A logical impossibility given the saturation levels, Kalen countered. They are either latent psychers, somehow resistant, or they are a new vector for the infection. Praetor, you are to subject all survivors to the most stringent purity screening, the Argent test. Any who fail are to be terminated before they cross the threshold. Understood. The Codex Astartes has no provision for this war, but the principle of quarantine remains. Valerius out. The channel died. The silence that followed was filled only with the hum of the engine and the distant, maddening thrum. "He's bringing survivors," Lysandra said, her voice barely audible. "He is bringing variables," Kalen corrected. "And in an equation this delicate, a single variable can lead to catastrophic failure." He turned back to his machine. The Necron shard pulsed, and for a moment Kalen felt a sensation he had not experienced in decades, a profound spiritual cold. It was the absence of everything, of emotion, of soul, of life itself. It was peace of a sort, the peace of the grave. He found it preferable to the alternative. The journey of Praetor Valerius and his surviving Scutari was a descent through a landscape of living nightmare. The wide, adamantium-reinforced corridors of the granite citadel were gone. In their place were organic tunnels, glistening with pink and purple mucus. The air was hot, humid, and thick with the smell of perfume and rot. Phosphorescent fungi, shaped like grasping hands, grew in clusters, casting a sickly light. The constant whispered singing was louder here, a chorus of millions of tiny voices coming from the walls themselves. Valerius, his red robes stained with ichor and soot, led from the front. His face was a grim mask of flesh and metal, his one remaining organic eye scanning the treacherous ground while his bionic replacement cycled through thermal and UV spectra. His radium carbine was warm in his hands. Behind him marched the remnants of his maniple, 27 vanguard and rangers from an original force of over 200. Their once pristine chrome and crimson armor was pitted, scarred, and splattered with unnatural biomatter. And behind them, a pitiful column of perhaps 50 civilians, engineers, servitor handlers, scribes, their faces hollow with terror and exhaustion. They were the unchanged, the ones who had, through some fluke of genetics or will, resisted the transformation. They huddled together, flinching at every drip, every squelch, every distant, gleeful shriek. "Steady," Valerius's voice buzzed through the squad vox. "The enemy preys on fear. It is a data source it can use. Emit the cant of aversion. Focus your minds on the pure formulae of the Omnissiah." The Scutari began a low, rhythmic chant in binary, a stream of mathematical constants and logical axioms. It was a psychic shield of sorts, a wall of pure reason against the encroaching insanity. It seemed to help. The whispering voices in the walls receded slightly, becoming annoyed, frustrated. They reached a central concourse that had once been a bustling hub for cargo loaders. Now it was a cathedral of flesh. The high ceiling was a vast, pulsating heart, its ventricles contracting with a wet, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. The pillars were fused spines, twisted together. The floor was a carpet of writhing, finger-like tendrils that tried to grasp their ankles. And in the center, where a statue of the Omnissiah had once stood, was a towering, beautiful, and utterly monstrous figure. It was roughly humanoid, androgynous and perfect in its proportions, carved from what appeared to be mother of pearl and weeping, liquid gold. It had 4 arms, each ending in delicate, sculpted hands, but its face was a featureless oval, and from its back unfurled wings of vibrating crystalline sound. It was the source of the concourse's particular strand of the song, a melody so achingly beautiful it made the humans weep, even as it promised the unmaking of their form. An ephemeral angel, one of the rangers voxed, his targeting reticule dancing over the creature's heart. A greater emanation, its song rewrites biological code at a touch. The angel raised its hands, and the music swelled. The very air began to shimmer. A Scutari vanguard to Valerius's left stumbled, his armor groaning. The ceramite plates began to flow like liquid, fusing together. His rad carbine melted into his hands, becoming a part of him. He screamed, a raw human sound that was quickly subsumed into a gurgle of pleasure as his body bloated and transformed, sprouting chitinous plates and a new flower-like mouth that joined the chorus. "Open fire, all frequencies!" Valerius roared. A storm of radioactive fire and solid slugs tore into the beautiful creature. Chips of mother-of-pearl flew, rivulets of gold splashed onto the fleshy floor, where they sizzled and burned. The angel's song faltered, becoming a screech of dissonance. It was not invulnerable, but it was resilient. "It's drawing power from the environment," Valerius barked. "Ranger squad, target the central cardiac organ on the ceiling." "Vanguard, press the assault! Disrupt its form!" The Rangers' transuranic arquebuses spoke with deafening cracks, punching fist-sized holes in the giant beating heart. Ichor, black and thick as oil, rained down. The angel shuddered, its form flickering. Seizing the moment, Valerius charged. He was no mere commander. He was a product of the genitor magos, his flesh and bone enhanced to superhuman levels. He moved with a speed that belied his heavy armor, his power sword, the Cognis Incarnadine, springing to life in his hand with a crackle of blue energy. He ducked under a sweep of a crystalline wing that would have sheared him in two and brought the power sword around in a devastating arc. It bit deep into the angel's torso. This was not a wound that could be easily healed. The power field disrupted the warp stuff holding the creature together. The beautiful form contorted in silent agony, the featureless face cracking into a rictus of surprise. With a final shove, Valerius cleaved the thing in two. The two halves did not fall. They dissolved, not into gore, but into a cloud of shimmering, melancholic dust and a fading, dissonant chord. The heart on the ceiling gave one last convulsive beat and fell still. Silence descended, broken only by the heavy breathing of the Scutari and the sobs of the survivors. "Move!" Valerius commanded, his voice hoarse. "The silence will not last." They pressed on, the path ahead now clear of the malevolent presence, but no less horrifying. They passed through a chamber, where the dead of the initial outbreak had been stacked, only to find them fused into a single giant, weeping face that called out their names. They crossed a bridge that was a rib cage, each step sinking into spongy cartilage. Finally, after an eternity of horror, they saw it, the massive blast-proof doors of the archive spire, etched with the cog and skull of the Mechanicus. They were scarred and dented, but they were whole. They were real. Valerius approached the comms panel. Magos Kalen, this is Praetor Valerius. We are at the gate, open. There was a long pause. Then the heavy gears within the door began to grind. The doors parted with a hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing the stark, sterile, and blessedly normal interior of the spire. The hum of machinery and the smell of oil were the most beautiful things Valerius had ever experienced. As the ragged column filed in, a team of Kalen's tech acolytes, their faces grim and their hands on sidearms, moved to meet them. The Argent Test, the lead acolyte stated, holding up a device that glowed with a harsh silver light. By order of Magos Kalen, all must be screened. The stark utilitarian light of the archive spire's antechamber was a physical relief after the bioluminescent hell outside. The survivors collapsed onto the cold metal floor, gasping, weeping with gratitude. The Scutari fanned out, their weapons still raised, performing a tactical scan of the sterile environment. It was so clean, so ordered. It felt like a dream. Magos Kalen descended from the upper gantry, his mechanical gait precise and unnervingly calm. His multi-lensed eyes swept over the bedraggled group, processing data. 53 civilians, 27 Scutari, most with depleted power packs and compromised systems. Praetor Valerius, his biosigns indicating elevated stress hormones and minor physical trauma. Praetor, Kalen's synthetic voice echoed in the vast space. Your arrival is timely. The project nears completion. Valerius removed his helmet, revealing a face etched with fatigue and the memory of horrors. Timely? We are all that is left, Magos. The granite citadel has fallen. The enemy is not an army you can defeat. It is a tide. It is the air itself. A poetic but inaccurate assessment, Kalen replied, his gaze shifting to the tech acolytes who were now moving among the civilians with the Argent Test device. It was a small silver orb that emitted a field of null energy, harmless to most, but agonizing for those whose souls were touched by the warp. The phenomenon has rules. It requires a psychic conduit, a vulnerability in the material realm. My project will eliminate that vulnerability. As if on cue, one of the civilians, a young female scribe, shrieked as the acolyte passed the orb near her. A faint pinkish aura flickered around her for a moment. She clutched her head, whimpering. No, please. I just heard the music. I didn't. I resisted. The lead acolyte looked to Kalen. The Magos gave a single slight nod. The flesh is weak, the acolyte stated, and before anyone could react, he raised his last pistol and fired. A single precise shot to the head. The woman crumpled, a look of betrayed surprise frozen on her face. A stunned silence fell over the chamber. Then cries of outrage and fear. "You monster!" a man shouted, surging to his feet. Valerius stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his power sword, his Scutari leveling their weapons at the terrified civilians. "Stand down!" Valerius's voice boomed, not at the civilians, but at his own troops. He turned to Kalen, his eye blazing with fury. "What is the meaning of this, Magos? She was unchanged. She survived." "She was a latent psyker," Kalen explained, utterly unmoved. "Her resistance was merely a prelude to a far more catastrophic transformation. She was a loaded weapon, waiting for the correct psychic trigger. My calculations indicate a 94% probability she would have manifested a full-scale Imperial breach within this spire within the next 12 cycles, undoing all our work. The elimination of the variable was the only logical course of action. Your calculations? Valerius spat. You murdered one of our own based on a probability? I preserved the many by sacrificing the one. It is the fundamental calculus of survival. Continue the screening. The grim process continued. 2 more were found to have the taint and were summarily executed. The rest passed, their spirits broken by the cold brutality of their salvation. They were herded away to a quarantined section of the spire, under the watchful eyes of both Scutari and Kalen's acolytes. An atmosphere of mutual distrust now filled the sanctuary. Later in the central laboratory, the tension was palpable. Valerius stood before Kalen, his arms crossed. Lysandra worked quietly at her console, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Your sanctuary is built on fear and murder, Kalen, Valerius stated. It is built on logic and necessity, Kalen countered, gesturing to the humming engine surrounding the Necron shard. This device, when activated, will generate a field extending approximately 500 meters from this spire. Within that field, the warp will be nullified. The laws of physics will reign supreme. The change will be reversed. It is our only hope. Valerius stared at the pulsating green shard. It felt wrong. Not evil, like the things outside, but profoundly alien. A void. You are tapping into xenosorcery. This is tech heresy of the highest order. The omniscience truth is found in all technology, Kalen recited, though the dogma sounded hollow even to him. This is a tool, a weapon, and it is the only one that works. My scans confirm it. The shard's field is already providing a localized damping effect. The psychic resonance within this room is 0.003% of what it is outside the door. At what cost? Valerius pressed. I felt it when I approached the engine. It doesn't just silence the warp, Kalen. It silences everything. It is a spiritual vacuum. To be saved by that, is it any better than being consumed by the madness outside? That is a philosophical question, Praetor. I deal in practical solutions. The device requires a final component, a massive power surge to initiate the field. I will need you to reroute the primary plasma core's output directly to this chamber. It will leave the rest of the spire on emergency power, but it is a necessary risk. Valerius was silent for a long time, his gaze moving from the heretical machine to the Magos's implacable face, and finally to Lysandra, who looked like a ghost haunting her own console. He was a soldier. His duty was to protect human life and serve the machine god. But now, those two imperatives were in direct conflict. Protecting these people seemed to require embracing a heresy that sickened his soul. Very well, he said finally, the words tasting of ash. I will see it done. But know this, Magos, when this is over, there will be a reckoning for what you have done here today. If my project fails, Praetor, Kalen said, turning back to his console, there will be no one left to do the reckoning. As Valerius left to carry out his orders, Lysandra finally spoke. He's right, you know. About the cost. Kalen's mechadendrites twitched. Sentiment is a cognitive trap, apprentice. The universe is not fair. It is not kind. It is a set of physical laws and emergent phenomena. The warp is one such phenomenon. This, he tapped the console connected to the Necron shard, is another. We are not choosing between good and evil. We are choosing between existence and non-existence. There is no moral dimension to that choice. Only a binary outcome. But the people out there, Lysandra gestured vaguely towards the sealed doors, they're not non-existent. They're something else. They're happy, in their own way. They feel no pain, only ecstasy. Kalen turned his full attention to her, his lens cluster focusing with an audible click. That is the most dangerous lie of all, Lysandra. What they feel is not ecstasy. It is the electrochemical simulation of ecstasy, imposed by a parasitic dimension that consumes their individuality, their souls, and their very physical form for its own inscrutable purposes. It is the happiness of a nerve being stimulated. It is not real. What we preserve here, cold and flawed as it is real. It is truth. Never confuse the two. His words were logical, irrefutable. And yet, as Lysandra looked at the cold, green glow of the shard, she couldn't help but feel that the truth he worshipped was just as hollow and just as hungry as the madness it sought to destroy. Outside the spire, the world continued its metamorphosis. The fleshy plains had given way to forests of crystalline trees that chimed in the non-existent wind. Rivers of shimmering emotional energy flowed where coolant ducts had once been. The sky vortex had stabilized, a permanent, weeping wound in the cosmos, and from it, new and ever more bizarre concepts were being born into physical form. The ephemeral angel that Valerius had destroyed was not missed. Its death was merely a note in the grand symphony, a moment of dissonance that made the subsequent harmony all the sweeter. In the heart of what was once the main habitation dome, a new consciousness was coalescing. It called itself the Weaving Heart. It was not a single entity, but a gestalt, a fusion of 1,000 transformed souls and the landscape itself. It was the conductor of the symphony, the artist directing the grand work. Down in the antechamber, the massive blast doors groaned as something immense began to pound against them. The sound was not of metal on metal, but of 1,000 fists of solid sound hammering in unison. The thick adamantium buckled inward with each blow, the sound deafening. The Scutari took up positions, their rad carbines and arc rifles aimed at the door. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and fear. "Stand firm!" Valerius yelled over the din. "They cannot breach the door. We have the advantage." He was wrong. The assault was not merely physical. The angel's song changed, shifting from a melody of annihilation to one of subtle, insidious persuasion. It did not attack the door. It spoke to the door. The music seeped through the microscopic gaps in the seal, a psychic virus targeting the machine spirits within the complex locking mechanism. A red light began to flash on a control panel. A tech acolyte monitoring it cried out, "Magos, the door's machine spirit. It's becoming agitated. It's rejecting the lockdown command." "Override it," Kalen's voice snapped over the vox. "I can't. It's singing along." With a final shuddering groan, the great gears of the door reversed. The massive bolts retracted. The door, designed to withstand a direct artillery hit, began to swing open, not from force, but from a willing, traitorous compliance from within. "Brace for contact," Valerius roared. The door opened just enough to reveal the hellscape outside and the things waiting there. The crystalline warriors stood in perfect silent rows, their forms reflecting the terrified faces of the defenders. Then they charged. The antechamber became a charnel house. Rad beam met crystalline flesh, shattering warriors into shrapnel-like shards. Arc lightning cooked the molten brass beasts into slag. But for every one that fell, two more took its place. They were not living things that could be killed. They were ideas given form, and ideas are hard to eradicate. Worse were the sonic attacks. The new angel's song, now unfiltered, washed over the defenders. Two Scutari vanguard, their minds already strained from days of fighting, suddenly lowered their weapons. A look of blissful peace crossed their faces as their armor began to flow and change, incorporating the deep magenta and gold of the enemy. They turned their weapons on their former comrades. "They are turning our own against us," a ranger screamed before a blast of radioactive fire from a corrupted vanguard took him in the chest. Valerius fought like a demon. His power soared, a blur of blue energy. He was a rock in the torrent, hewing through crystalline limbs and dissolving brass constructs. But he was one man, and the tide was endless. He saw his soldiers falling, not just to enemy weapons, but to the song, their bodies betraying them in moments of transcendent revelation. "We have survived," he said. "That is all that ever mattered." 5 standard years later, a ship finally came. It was a Cobra-class destroyer, the His Will Enduring, part of a long-range patrol sent to investigate the lost Forge outpost. They had expected to find ruins or perhaps nothing at all. They did not expect to find a signal, a weak repeating beacon broadcasting a simple Mechanicus ident code on a loop. Calthos Tertius, survivors. The landing party, led by a grim-faced Imperial Navy armsman named Captain Evander, descended in a Thunderhawk. The world they set down on was a tomb. The sky was clear and cold, the pale sun offering no warmth. The wind blew across endless plains of gray, crystalline dust that had once been a living landscape. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, nothing. They followed the beacon to the archive spire. The great doors were sealed, but a smaller access hatch hissed open at their approach. The air that wafted out was sterile and cold. Inside, they found a society of ghosts. A few hundred people moved through the stark corridors. They did not speak. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They performed their duties, maintaining the life support, tending the hydroponic gardens, monitoring the auspex with a quiet, mechanical efficiency. There was no laughter, no conversation, no emotion. They were like living servitors. They were led to the central laboratory where Magos Kalen awaited them. The Magos looked exactly as he had 5 years before, a statue of metal and dogma. The heretical engine was gone, dismantled. Only the Necron shard remained, sitting on its plinth, dark and inert once more. "Magos," Captain Evander said, his voice unnaturally loud in the crushing silence. "By the grace of the God Emperor, we have found you. We are here to evacuate you." Kalen's head tilted. "Evacuation is not necessary. The outpost is secure. The Imperial threat has been neutralized. Evander looked around at the hollow-eyed survivors. These people, what happened to them? They were saved, Kalen stated. The null field, while necessary to eradicate the corruption, had lingering effects on the augmented human psyche. It scoured them clean of the Imperial taint, but also of the emotional and spiritual capacities that make them vulnerable to it. They are now perfectly efficient, perfectly logical, and perfectly safe. Evander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had seen the horrors of the galaxy, the carnage of Xenos invasions, the bloody-handed work of heretics. But he had never seen anything as profoundly unsettling as this. This was not salvation. This was a lobotomy on a planetary scale. And the weapon you used? Evander asked carefully. A Xenos artifact, since neutralized, Kalen said, his tone forbidding further inquiry. The technical data has been purged to prevent misuse. Evander found a lone figure sitting in a small observation room, staring out at the dead gray plains. It was a young woman, her face gaunt, her eyes holding a depth of sorrow that was absent in all the others. "You are Lysandra?" he asked gently, having been briefed by one of the few who could still string a sentence together. She nodded slowly, not looking at him. "What happened here, child?" he asked, his voice soft. She was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice a dry rustle. "We were given a choice," she said, "between a beautiful lie and an ugly truth." She finally turned to look at him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it made him flinch. "We chose the truth, and the truth is nothing." Captain Evander led the survivors of Calthos Tertius onto his ship. They were listed in the official report as miraculous survivors of a catastrophic warp event, their spirits understandably dimmed by the ordeal. But Evander knew what he had seen. They had not faced the horror of war or the terror of demons. They had faced something far, far worse. They had been offered a universe of infinite, maddening joy, and they had chosen instead to embrace the void. They had won their world back from hell, only to discover that the victory had cost them everything that made life worth living. As the His Will, enduring, broke orbit, leaving the scoured, silent rock of Calthos Tertius behind, Evander looked down at the gray world and knew, with a certainty that would haunt him until his dying day, that there were fates in the 41st millennium far more horrifying than simple death. Some victories were a silence more terrible than any scream.